Blessings and welcome to today's Law Enforcement Daily Devotional. Today we are in Romans chapters 9 through 11, 911. No mistake about that. Today Paul is talking to the Jews and he's talking to them about God's justice concerning man and why God calls some and he doesn't call others. And he really lays it out very well about how the Jews still think that just because they were born Jewish, that salvation is their right, it's their entitlement, and it's not. He goes on, and all throughout 9 through 11, he talks about what it's going to take to gain salvation through Jesus Christ, that Jesus is that bridge from where we are to where we want to be, a salvation in God and heaven. In 9:15, Paul reminds us what God said in Exodus when God was talking to Moses, and God said, I'll have mercy on who I want to have mercy on, and I'll have compassion on who I want to have compassion on. In other words, it's all God's choice. Not that God's going to be unfair or unjust about it, but it is ultimately, we're God's creation. And he's going to go on later to talk about pottery. And, if the potter is making a clay pot, who's the clay pot to say, hey, don't make me like this, make me like that? It's not the clay's choice, it's the potter. He's the creator, he's making it, he crafts it, it's his decision. But in chapter 9, verse 20 and 21, there's a law enforcement takeaway that you were created for this calling. If you truly know and believe that you were called into law enforcement, which most law enforcement officers that I've ever spoken to feel that way. I have spoken to a few that when annual reviews come up, as a sergeant, sit down and talk to officers and just, hey, why did you become a police officer? The money was good. The benefits were really good. It pays more than being a teacher pays, so I became a police officer. And that's not a calling. That's just a desire to make more money. So I do know that there are those out there that are not called. Um, it doesn't mean that they're bad people or that there's anything wrong with them. It just means they weren't called to be law enforcement officers. But just like in verses 20, 21, God will create us the way he wants us created. Um, it doesn't mean that God won't close doors and open other doors, and that he doesn't expect us to change and become who he has called us to be. We are created a certain way, we're wired a certain way, but we don't always make the choices that line up with what God's desires for us are. Our will does not always match up with his will because we're selfish, and his will and desire for us is to not be selfish, as we've seen in the fruit. So I hear people all the time say, well, God created me and God doesn't make mistakes. No, God does not make mistakes. God created a bunch of worms, and sometimes worms turn into caterpillars. But the difference is, we as worms, we have to make that decision, that choice to become a butterfly. It doesn't just happen for us. God gave us free will and expects us to choose him. If we're living a life of sin, God expects us to change and get out of that. So anyway, I don't want to get too far into that. Verse 10, chapter 10, verse 4. I love this verse. It says, for Christ is the end of the law of righteousness to everyone who believes. And this is kind of the goal that and direction we've been going with Paul for the last several days and maybe even weeks. The understanding that we're under law until we accept Christ, and then from that point on we're under grace and we've left law. Christ is the end of the law. You're in the law, you come to Christ. Christ is the end of the law and the beginning of grace. I just love how he says it here. Paul's been building the bridge, and that's what all this is getting to. And then here is the part where we go, where Christ is the end of the law. Christ, okay, law, Jesus, grace. But what about Jesus right here transforms us or moves us from this law to grace? What is that one thing in Christ? And here's what Paul tells us in 10:9. If you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Those two things. Declare with your mouth, confess. And when we get into this 9-day challenge, we're going to, once a day, we're going to confess with our mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord. And then we're going to produce the fruit for the rest of the day that points back to him. And then chapter 10, verse 10, it says, for it is with your heart that you believe and are justified. And it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. We all want to be saved. Real quick, I want to move into another law enforcement takeaway. You're a police officer. You're called, hopefully. 11:29 says, for the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable. If you're called into this profession, this is what God has called you to, and he's never going to remove that calling from your heart. Your desire to do this job and to help people and be a law enforcement officer is always going to be in your heart. Chapter 10, verses 13 through 15, if you're called, and then if you're set apart for the ministry, here is the calling. And I'm going to throw this caveat out there. The callings of God and the works that God's prepared for us are as different for every individual as our fingerprints are. So I'm not sitting here telling you what God's calling is on your life. I would never presume to do that, because God may have a totally different calling on your life. But as a law enforcement officer, here is a general calling for all of us. This is a part of our calling. And just because it may not be your specific calling, but it may be mine, or it may not be mine and it may be yours, God had Paul put this in here for a reason. And here's what it says. Think about this. You're a cop, you're a law enforcement officer, maybe a patrol officer. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's us. We're called. And if we do this, we are saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? This is the people of your jurisdiction, or your beat. This is your community, your family, your friends, your other law enforcement officers. How can they call? How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. As a set-apart Christian law enforcement officer, you're sent to do this. You're sent to preach so that they can hear and that they can believe, and then they can call on Jesus Christ and be saved. It's all right here in black and white. Tomorrow we're going to be in Romans chapters 12 through 15. Look forward to seeing you back here, and in the meantime, be safe.